For 30 years, Paul Raines had been the kind of soldier who came home when others didn't. His family had watched him walk through the front door after missions that should have killed him, grateful for another chance to hear his quiet voice at the dinner table. But when the 54-year-old Master Sergeant collapsed during a routine debriefing at Fort Braxton, something was different. The medics found black, rotting wounds covering his hands, wounds he'd been hiding for weeks. His body was shutting down in ways that made no medical sense. The doctors had never seen anything like it. Paul refused to explain what happened during his last mission in Eastern Europe, even as whatever was inside him began spreading. What had this decorated veteran encountered that he was willing to die rather than reveal? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Asterisk. Dr. Elena Vasquez had seen enough broken soldiers in her 28 years of military medicine to recognize when something was fundamentally wrong. The way Master Sergeant Paul Raines lay motionless on the hospital bed, his breathing shallow and labored, told her this wasn't exhaustion or combat stress. This was something else entirely. She pulled the thick manila folder from her desk. Paul's service record stretched back 3 decades, a testament to a man who had served his country with distinction across every major conflict zone. Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, classified operations in places that didn't appear on any official maps. Medals, commendations, letters of appreciation from generals whose names were redacted. The file was heavy with the weight of secrets and sacrifice. Elena adjusted her reading glasses, a reminder that at 58, she was closer to retirement than to the eager young doctor who had first donned military fatigues. Her hair, now more silver than black, was pulled back in the same practical bun she'd worn for years. The lines around her eyes spoke of countless nights spent in field hospitals, tending to soldiers who came to her broken in ways that couldn't always be healed. The wounds on Paul's hands defied every medical text she'd studied. Circular, about the size of quarters, they burrowed deep into the flesh with edges that appeared almost surgically precise. The tissue around each wound had turned a disturbing shade of black, as if something was consuming it from within. She'd ordered cultures, blood work, every test the base hospital could perform, but the results only deepened the mystery. Doctor? Nurse Patricia Chen knocked softly on the office door. At 32, Patricia had been Elena's most trusted assistant. For the past 5 years, someone who could read her moods and anticipate her needs with remarkable accuracy. Mrs. Raines is here. Elena closed the file and straightened her white coat. Margaret Raines was a woman she'd met before, during Paul's previous hospitalizations for minor injuries sustained in training. She remembered Margaret as someone who carried herself with the quiet strength that came from being married to a career soldier. Someone who understood that loving a man in uniform meant accepting that part of him would always belong to missions she could never know about. The waiting room held the familiar antiseptic smell that Elena had long since stopped noticing. Margaret sat in one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs, her hands folded in her lap, still wearing the business attire from her job at the county clerk's office. Her auburn hair showed traces of gray at the temples, and worry lines had deepened around her green eyes since Elena had last seen her. Mrs. Raines. Elena approached with the measured pace she'd learned to adopt when delivering difficult news. Thank you for coming so quickly. Margaret stood, her movements betraying the anxiety she was trying to control. How is he, doctor? They won't tell me anything specific, just that he collapsed during his debriefing. Elena gestured toward a quieter corner of the waiting room, away from the other families clustered around the coffee machine and outdated magazines. Paul is stable for now, but I won't lie to you, his condition is concerning. We're running additional tests to determine that because of his symptoms. What kind of symptoms? Margaret's voice carried the edge of someone who had spent years preparing herself for the worst news, yet never quite believing it would come. He has wounds on his hands that appear to be infected, but they're not responding to conventional treatment. He's been experiencing fever, disorientation, and his white blood cell count is severely elevated. Elena chose her words carefully, providing enough information to be honest, without overwhelming Margaret with details that might prove insignificant. Margaret's face paled. Wounds? Paul never mentioned any injuries. When he came home last week, he seemed fine. Tired, maybe, but fine. This caught Elena's attention. He's been home for a week? When did you first notice anything unusual? Now that I think about it, he was wearing long sleeves constantly, even though it's been warm. And he kept his hands in his pockets more than usual. Margaret's eyes filled with understanding and fear. He was hiding this from me. Elena nodded. Grimly. In her experience, soldiers who concealed injuries were usually protecting something more than their own health. They were protecting their families from worry, their units from concern, or sometimes they were protecting secrets that went far beyond personal well-being. Can I see him? Margaret asked. Of course, but I should warn you, he's been sedated. For pain management, and when he is conscious, he hasn't been very communicative about what happened during his last assignment. Elena led Margaret through the sterile corridors of the base hospital, past the familiar sights of wounded soldiers, in various stages of recovery. Young men and women who had sacrificed pieces of themselves in service to their country, attended by medical staff who understood that healing involved more than treating physical wounds. Paul's room was in the secure ward, a section of the hospital reserved for cases that required additional privacy. Elena had requested the transfer, partly for medical reasons. The unusual nature of his condition warranted careful monitoring, but also because something about the circumstances surrounding his illness felt deliberately obscured. Margaret gasped softly when she saw her husband. Paul looked smaller somehow, diminished by the machines that monitored his vital signs and the 4 lines that delivered medication and fluids. His face, usually tan from outdoor training exercises, had taken on a grayish pallor, but it was his hands visible above the white sheets that drew her immediate attention. The bandages couldn't completely hide the extent of the damage. Even wrapped in sterile gauze, the dark staining was visible, and the smell, a sweet cloying odor that Elena had never encountered in any textbook, permeated the room despite the ventilation system. My God, Margaret whispered, moving to his bedside and gently touching his forehead. What happened to him? Elena watched the interaction carefully. After nearly 3 decades of marriage, Margaret's touch seemed to provide some comfort, even in Paul's sedated state. His breathing became slightly more regular, and some of the tension left his shoulders. That's what we're trying to determine, Elena said. His mission report indicates he was part of a reconnaissance team investigating abandoned facilities in Romania. Nothing in the official documentation suggests any unusual hazards or exposures. Margaret looked up sharply. Romania? Paul told me he was going to Germany for routine training exercises. Another piece of the puzzle that didn't fit. Elena made a mental note to review Paul's travel orders more carefully. In her experience, discrepancies between official records and family communications often indicated classified operations, but they could also suggest something had gone wrong during the mission itself. Has he said anything to you about what he experienced there? Elena asked. Margaret shook her head, but Elena noticed the slight hesitation before she answered. Paul never talks about his missions. It's been that way for as long as I've known him, but this time was different. When he came home, he seemed troubled. Not just tired, but genuinely disturbed by something. Elena pulled up a chair, recognizing that Margaret needed time to process what she was seeing. And that sometimes the most important information came when families were given space to remember details they initially overlooked. "Tell me about that." "Last week at home," Elena said gently. Even small things that seemed unusual. Margaret settled into the chair beside Paul's bed, her hand finding his uninjured forearm. He was washing his hands constantly. "I thought maybe he'd been exposed to something during training, chemicals or dirt. But now I realize he was probably trying to clean those wounds. And he wouldn't let me do laundry, insisted on washing his own clothes. When I found his uniform shirt in the washing machine, there were bloodstains on the cuffs." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. Paul had been trying to conceal evidence of his condition, which suggested he understood something about the nature of his wounds that he wasn't sharing with medical personnel. Did he bring anything home from his mission? Equipment, souvenirs, anything unusual? Nothing that I saw, but Paul has a small storage room in the basement where he keeps some of his military gear. I never go through his things. He's always been private about his work. Margaret's voice carried the resignation of someone who had learned not to ask questions that wouldn't be answered. Elena made another mental note. If Paul had brought something back from Romania, something connected to his condition, it might still be in the house. The thought was both promising and troubling. Promising because it might provide answers. Troubling because it might represent a continued threat to Margaret and their family. "Mrs. Rains, I need to ask you something important," Elena said, choosing her words carefully. "Have you experienced any unusual symptoms since Paul returned home? Skin irritation, respiratory issues, fatigue, beyond what you'd normally expect?" Margaret considered the question seriously. "No, nothing like that. Should I be worried about contagion? We're taking all appropriate precautions, but at this point, we don't fully understand the nature of Paul's condition. As a precautionary measure, I'd like to run some basic tests on you as well: blood work, respiratory function, general health screening." Margaret nodded, understanding the implications without Elena having to spell them out explicitly. If Paul's condition was communicable, the entire family could be at risk. A soft knock interrupted their conversation. Colonel Harrison stood in the doorway, his expression serious and slightly impatient. Elena had worked with Harrison before. He was the liaison between the medical staff and command when soldiers were hospitalized for issues related to their military service. Usually, his visits were routine, but something about his demeanor suggested this case was different. "Dr. Vasquez, I need to speak with you privately," Harrison said, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request. Elena glanced at Margaret, who was studying the colonel with the wariness that military families develop toward unexpected official visits. "Mrs. Rains, why don't you spend some time with Paul while I handle this administrative matter? I'll be back shortly." In the corridor outside Paul's room, Colonel Harrison's facade of professional courtesy dropped. "Doctor, I need to know everything about Sergeant Rains' condition and your treatment plan." "Colonel, you know I can't discuss specific medical information without proper authorization and patient consent." Harrison handed her a folder containing official letterhead and multiple signatures. "This is proper authorization. Sergeant Rains' condition may have national security implications." Elena scanned the documents quickly. The language was bureaucratic and vague, but the message was clear: Paul's case was being classified, and her normal protocols for patient confidentiality were being overridden by military necessity. "What aren't you telling me about his mission?" Elena asked directly. Harrison's expression remained neutral, but Elena caught the brief pause before he answered. "Everything you need to know is in Sergeant Rains' official mission report. Your focus should be on treating his immediate medical needs." Elena had heard variations of this response countless times over her career. It was the standard deflection, used when the military needed medical professionals to perform their duties without asking inconvenient questions about context or causation. "Colonel, I can't treat a patient effectively if I don't understand the cause of his condition. If Paul was exposed to something during his mission, chemicals, biological agents, radioactive materials, that information is crucial for determining appropriate treatment. Dr. Vasquez, I appreciate your concern for your patient, but some information remains classified regardless of medical necessity. Your job is to stabilize Sergeant Rains and prepare him for transfer to a more specialized facility. Elena felt the familiar frustration that came with trying to practice medicine within the constraints of military secrecy. Transfer? Colonel, Paul is stable here, and moving him could compromise his recovery. The decision has been made. Transport will be arranged within 48 hours. As Harrison walked away, Elena realized that Paul's case was becoming something more complicated than a medical mystery. The military's urgency to remove him from her care suggested they either knew more about his condition than they were admitting, or they were trying to prevent her from learning something they preferred to keep hidden. She returned to Paul's room to find Margaret holding his hand and speaking to him in low, comforting tones. Even unconscious, Paul seemed to respond to his wife's presence, his breathing becoming more regular and some of the tension leaving his face. Elena made a decision that would define everything that followed. Whatever was happening to Paul Rains, whatever secrets surrounded his condition, she would not allow bureaucratic convenience to override her medical judgment. If the military wanted to transfer her patient, they would have to provide medical justification that she could accept professionally. Looking at Margaret's worried face and Paul's deteriorating condition, Elena realized she was about to find herself in conflict with the very institution she had served faithfully for nearly 3 decades. But sometimes, she reflected, doing the right thing required risking everything you had worked to build. Elena arrived at the hospital before dawn, driven by an uneasiness that had kept her awake most of the night. Something about Colonel Harrison's urgency to transfer Paul didn't align with standard medical protocols, and her years of military service had taught her to trust her instincts when official explanations felt incomplete. Paul's condition had deteriorated overnight. The black discoloration around his wounds had spread beyond the original circular patterns, creating web-like extensions that traced up his forearms like dark veins beneath the skin. His fever had spiked to 104 degrees, and the antibiotics that should have provided some relief seemed to have no effect whatsoever. "Doctor, we've been trying to reach you," Nurse Chun said, as Elena entered the secure ward. Mr. Rains became agitated around 3 this morning. He was asking for something called the sample repeatedly before we had to sedate him again. Elena felt her pulse quicken. The sample? Did he say anything else? He kept saying he had to destroy it, that no one could find it. When Dr. Morrison tried to examine his hands, Mr. Rains became combative, insisting that we couldn't let them take it. Elena reviewed Paul's chart, noting the increased heart rate and blood pressure that suggested significant distress even under sedation. Whatever Paul had encountered in Romania, his subconscious mind was still grappling with it, treating it as an active threat rather than a past experience. Margaret arrived shortly after visiting hours began, carrying a small overnight bag and the determined expression of someone who had decided to maintain a vigil regardless of hospital policies. Elena noticed that Margaret moved more slowly than usual, with a slight tremor in her hands that could have been attributed to stress and lack of sleep. "How is he this morning?" Margaret asked, though Paul's appearance provided much of the answer. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and even unconscious, his breathing seemed labored. "Margaret, I need to ask you something important," Elena said, guiding her to the chairs beside Paul's bed. "Last night, Paul mentioned something called the sample. Have you seen him with anything unusual since he returned from his mission? Any containers, vials, bags of soil, or plant material?" Margaret's reaction was immediate and telling. Her face went pale, and she glanced toward the door, as if checking for eavesdroppers. I am not sure I should, Margaret. Paul's life may depend on this information. If he brought something back that's connected to his condition, I need to know. Margaret was quiet for several moments, clearly wrestling with competing loyalties. Finally, she spoke in a whisper. The night he came home, I heard him in the basement for hours. When I went down to check on him, he was cleaning something in a small jar, looked like dirt or sand. When he saw me, he became angry, told me to go upstairs and not to come back down. Elena felt pieces of the puzzle beginning to align. Where is this jar now? I don't know. Paul said he had disposed of it, but I found traces of that same dark soil in the washing machine when I cleaned his uniforms. It had an unusual smell, sweet but also rotten, like flowers left too long in water. The description matched the odor Elena had noticed in Paul's room, a smell that seemed to intensify as his condition worsened. If Paul had brought back contaminated material from Romania, it might explain both his infection and his desperate attempts to conceal evidence of his exposure. Margaret, I need you to listen to me carefully. Until we understand what Paul was exposed to, your house may not be safe. Is there somewhere else you can stay? Family? Friends? Before Margaret could answer, Colonel Harrison appeared in the doorway. Again, accompanied by two soldiers Elena didn't recognize. Their presence felt official and somewhat menacing, transforming the quiet hospital room into something that resembled an interrogation site. Dr. Vasquez, Mrs. Raines. Harrison acknowledged them with perfunctory politeness. I need to speak with both of you about Sergeant Raines' transfer arrangements. Elena stood, positioning herself between the soldiers and Paul's bed in a gesture that was partly protective and partly defiant. Colonel, I informed you yesterday that I don't believe Paul is stable enough for transport. Medical transport has been arranged with appropriate life support equipment. Sergeant Raines will receive excellent care at Walter Reed Medical Center, where they have more specialized resources for cases like his. Cases like his? Elena challenged. Colonel, what exactly do you know about Paul's condition that you haven't shared with his attending physician? Harrison's expression hardened. Dr. Vasquez, you seem to be misunderstanding your role here. Your medical assessment has been noted, but the decision to transfer Sergeant Raines has been made at levels well above both of our authority. Margaret stepped forward, her voice carrying the firm tone of someone who had spent years navigating military bureaucracy. Colonel, I want to understand what you mean by cases like his. Are you telling us that other soldiers have had similar symptoms? The question caught Harrison off guard, and Elena noticed the brief glance he exchanged with one of the accompanying soldiers. It was a look that confirmed her growing suspicion that Paul's condition wasn't as mysterious to the military as they were pretending. Mrs. Raines, I understand your concern for your husband, but some aspects of military medical care involve classified information that can't be shared with civilian family members. Elena felt anger building in her chest. Colonel, I've been treating military personnel for 28 years. I have top secret clearance and have maintained patient confidentiality under the most challenging circumstances. If there's information that can help Paul, I need to know what it is. Doctor, your clearance doesn't extend to all compartmentalized information. The nature of Sergeant Raines' mission and potential exposure involves ongoing national security concerns. At that moment, Paul's vital signs monitor began alarming. His heart rate had spiked dramatically, and his blood pressure was dropping. Elena moved quickly to his bedside, checking his pupils and noting that the dark discoloration on his arms had spread, noticeably even in the few minutes since Harrison had arrived. I need everyone out except medical personnel, Elena said, calling for Nurse Chun and preparing emergency medications. Margaret, please wait in the corridor. As Elena worked to stabilize Paul, she became aware of heated voices outside the room. Through the partially open door, she could hear Margaret confronting Colonel Harrison with a force that surprised everyone present. Colonel, my husband has served this country for 30 years. He's been wounded in combat. He's missed birthdays and anniversaries and holidays. He's risked his life in places I can't even pronounce. If he's dying because of something that happened during his service, I have a right to know what it is. Elena administered medication to bring Paul's blood pressure back to acceptable levels, but she could see that his condition was deteriorating rapidly. Whatever was affecting him was accelerating, and conventional treatment was proving completely ineffective. Paul's eyes opened suddenly, startling Elena. For a moment, his gaze was clear and focused, cutting through the sedation with urgent intelligence. "Doctor," he whispered, his voice hoarse but understandable. "You have to stop them from taking me. There are others, Torres, Martinez, Williams. They're all sick." Elena leaned closer, recognizing that this moment of clarity might be brief and critically important. "Paul, what happened in Romania? What did you bring back?" "We found the facility. It wasn't abandoned. They were still using it. The experiments never stopped." Paul's grip on Elena's arm was surprisingly strong. "I took samples to prove what they were doing. They can't let anyone know." "Who can't let anyone know? The Romanian government? Our government?" Paul's eyes began to lose focus as the sedation reasserted itself, but he managed one more crucial piece of information. "Check the basement storage unit, number 47. Margaret has the key." Elena realized that Paul's condition wasn't just a medical emergency. It was evidence of something much larger and more dangerous. If other soldiers were exhibiting similar symptoms, and if Paul's mission had uncovered some kind of ongoing biological research, then his transfer to Walter Reed might not be about providing better medical care. She looked through the door at Margaret, who was still confronting Colonel Harrison with the determined courage of someone who had decided that her husband's life was worth risking her own safety. Elena made a decision that would change the course of everything that followed. Walking to the door, she addressed Colonel Harrison directly. "Colonel, I'm declaring Paul Raines too unstable for transport. As his attending physician, I'm invoking my medical authority to keep him here until his condition stabilizes." Harrison's face darkened. "Doctor, you're exceeding your authority." "No, Colonel, I'm exercising it. If you want to transfer my patient, you'll need to find another doctor willing to sign off on transport orders. I won't do it." Elena realized she had just challenged the military hierarchy that had defined her entire career. But looking at Paul's deteriorating condition and Margaret's desperate face, she knew she couldn't allow bureaucratic convenience to override her medical judgment. What she didn't yet understand was that her decision to keep Paul at the base hospital had just made her a threat to people who were willing to sacrifice individual soldiers to protect institutional secrets. The battle for Paul's life was about to become a battle for the truth about what the military had been hiding in Romanian forests, and Elena had just positioned herself directly in the line of fire. Elena spent the night researching everything she could find about Romanian military facilities and biological research programs. The base hospital's medical library was limited, but her security clearance allowed her access to classified databases that contained fragments of information about Cold War-era experiments and abandoned Soviet installations. What she discovered was troubling. During the 1960s and 1970s, Romania had hosted several joint research facilities with the Soviet Union, many focused on biological warfare development. Most of these facilities had supposedly been decommissioned after the fall of communism, but the records were incomplete, with significant gaps that suggested ongoing classification. Margaret had spent the night in the hospital waiting room, refusing to leave despite Elena's suggestions that she go home and rest. When Elena found her the next morning, Margaret looked exhausted but determined, clutching a small key in her hand. "This is for storage unit 47, Margaret said, without preamble. "Paul gave it to me years ago. Told me it was for emergency documents and some of his military equipment. I've never looked inside. Elena accepted the key, understanding the trust that Margaret was placing in her. Margaret, before we do anything with this, I need to ask you again. Have you experienced any symptoms? Fatigue, skin irritation, anything unusual? Margaret hesitated. I've been feeling more tired than usual, and yesterday I noticed a small rash on my wrist. I assumed it was stress or an allergic reaction to the hospital soap. Elena felt her stomach tighten. If Margaret was showing early signs of exposure, it meant the contamination could be spreading beyond Paul. Let me examine that rash. The mark on Margaret's wrist was small, but distinctive, a circular irritation about the size of a dime, with slightly raised edges and a darker center. It looked disturbingly similar to the early stages of Paul's wounds. Margaret, I need you to understand that you may have been exposed to the same agent that's affecting Paul. I want to start you on a precautionary antibiotic regimen and run some blood tests. Margaret nodded, but Elena could see the fear in her eyes. Doctor, what exactly are we dealing with? Is this some kind of chemical weapon? Elena chose her words carefully. I don't know yet, but based on Paul's mission location and the unusual nature of his symptoms, it's possible he encountered something biological in nature. Something that may have been developed as a weapon, but could also be a naturally occurring pathogen that's been weaponized. As they spoke, Elena's pager buzzed with an urgent message. She called the number and found herself speaking with a colleague at the Centers for Disease Control. Dr. Vasquez? This is Dr. Sarah Chun at CDC Atlanta. We received some unusual lab results from your facility regarding a patient named Rains. Can you tell me more about his condition? Elena stepped away from Margaret for privacy. Dr. Chun, how did CDC become involved in this case? That's what I was hoping you could tell me. Someone at the Pentagon requested that we consult on a potential biological exposure involving military personnel. The blood samples we received show indicators that we've never seen before, some kind of synthetic biological agent that appears to be designed to evade immune response. Elena felt a chill. Synthetic? You're telling me this was created in a laboratory? The preliminary analysis suggests a highly sophisticated biological weapon, possibly based on fungal spores that have been genetically modified. Dr. Vasquez, if this patient was exposed during a military operation, we need to know immediately if there are other potential victims. Elena thought about Paul's desperate words about Torres, Martinez, and William's other soldiers who might be experiencing similar symptoms. Dr. Chun, how can I reach you directly? This situation may be more complex than a single exposure case. After ending the call, Elena returned to Margaret with a heavy heart. The conversation with CDC had confirmed her worst fears. Paul hadn't simply been exposed to something dangerous. He'd been exposed to something that had been deliberately created to harm. Margaret, I need you to think carefully about something. Paul mentioned names of other soldiers last night. Torres, Martinez, Williams. Do any of those names sound familiar? Margaret considered the question. Torres, yes. Sergeant Roberto Torres. He and Paul have worked together for years. Roberto was supposed to come to dinner last weekend, but he canceled at the last minute. Said he wasn't feeling well. Elena felt the scope of the crisis expanding. If Torres was also affected, it meant the exposure wasn't limited to Paul. Though, you know how to contact Torres or his family. His wife Carmen and I are friends. She's been worried about Roberto. He's been sick for over a week, but won't go to the doctor. Says it's just a training injury. Elena realized she needed to act quickly. If other soldiers were exhibiting similar symptoms and refusing medical treatment, they might be dying while the military covered up the extent of the exposure. Margaret, I need you to call Carmen Torres. Tell her it's urgent that Roberto come to the hospital immediately. Don't explain why over the phone, but make it clear that his life may depend on getting medical attention. While Margaret made the call, Elena returned to Paul's room to check on his condition. His vital signs had stabilized somewhat, but the dark discoloration continued to spread. She noticed something new. The smell in his room had intensified, and there seemed to be a faint phosphorescent quality to the infected tissue when the lights were dimmed. Paul stirred as she examined his arms, his eyes opening with the same urgent clarity she had seen the day before. "Doctor," he whispered, "you have to find Dr. Kozlov. He worked at the facility during the Soviet era. He knows what they were developing there." Elena leaned closer. "Paul, where can I find Dr. Kozlov? He defected in 1989. Lives in Virginia now, works as a consultant." "Elena." Paul used her first name with surprising intimacy. "They're going to try to transfer me again. Don't let them. If I disappear into their system, you'll never find out what really happened." Before Elena could respond, Paul's eyes closed again, but his warning reverberated in her mind. She realized that her decision to refuse the transfer order had bought them time, but the military wouldn't accept her defiance indefinitely. Margaret returned with news that Roberto Torres was on his way to the hospital, despite his wife's concerns that he could barely stand. Elena felt a mixture of relief and dread. Relief that another victim might receive treatment. Dread about what Torres' condition might reveal about the extent of the biological attack. As she prepared to examine Torres, Elena found herself thinking about Dr. Kozlov. If Paul was right, and this Soviet-era scientist was still alive and living in Virginia, he might be the key to understanding what had been created in those Romanian facilities and how to counter its effects. Elena realized she was about to cross another line. Finding and contacting Dr. Kozlov would require her to conduct an unauthorized investigation that could be interpreted as espionage or treason. But looking at Paul's deteriorating condition and thinking about Margaret's developing symptoms, she understood that conventional channels weren't going to provide the answers she needed. She made another decision that would define the rest of this crisis. Whatever the personal cost, she would find Dr. Kozlov and learn the truth about what had been unleashed in those Romanian forests. Paul's life, Margaret's health, and potentially the safety of countless other soldiers depended on her willingness to risk everything she had built in service to the truth. The battle for answers was about to become a race against time, with Elena caught between her loyalty to the military that had shaped her career and her obligation to the patients who trusted her with their lives. Roberto Torres arrived at the hospital in worse condition than Elena had feared. Carmen Torres had to support him as he walked, and even from across the emergency room, Elena could see the telltale dark markings on his hands and forearms. Whatever had infected Paul was following the same progression in Torres, but his symptoms appeared more advanced. "Dr. Vasquez," Carmen said, her voice tight with controlled panic. "Roberto has been sick for 10 days, but he kept insisting it was just a training injury. This morning, he could barely get out of bed." Elena examined Torres quickly, noting that the circular wounds covered not just his hands, but extended up both arms nearly to his elbows. His fever was higher than Paul's had been, and his breathing was labored in a way that suggested the infection was affecting his respiratory system. "Sergeant Torres," Elena said gently, "I'm treating another soldier with very similar symptoms. I need you to tell me about your recent mission to Romania." Torres' eyes widened with surprise and fear. "How do you know about Romania? That mission is classified." "Because Master Sergeant Rains is in the bed down the hall, and he's fighting the same infection you are. Roberto, I need to know what you both were exposed to if I'm going to help either of you." Torres looked at his wife, then back at Elena. The conflict between military secrecy and personal survival played out across his face before he made his decision. "We weren't supposed to be there," Torres said quietly. "Our official orders were for routine reconnaissance, but when we arrived, Colonel Morrison redirected us to investigate reports of activity at an abandoned Soviet facility. Elena felt another piece of the puzzle fall into place. What kind of activity? Local villagers reported strange lights and vehicles at night. When we investigated, we found that the facility wasn't abandoned. There were people working there. Americans and Europeans, conducting some kind of research. Torres paused, his breathing becoming more labored. Elena administered oxygen and pain medication before encouraging him to continue. We were ordered to collect samples of everything: soil, water, plant material, anything that might indicate what kind of research was being conducted. Paul found a storage room with hundreds of specimen containers, labeled with dates going back decades. What was in the containers? Elena asked. Biological material. Fungal cultures, soil samples, plant specimens that had been genetically modified. Some of the labels were in Russian, others in English. The dates showed continuous research from the 1960s through last month. Elena realized that Paul and his team had stumbled onto something much larger than an abandoned facility. They had discovered an ongoing biological weapons program that had survived the end of the Cold War and was still active. Roberto, did you and Paul handle these specimens directly? Torres nodded weakly. We were wearing gloves, but some of the containers were damaged. Paul insisted on collecting samples to bring back as evidence, even though it violated our mission parameters. Carmen Torres grasped Elena's arm. Doctor, is Roberto going to be okay? Can you treat this? Elena wished she could provide reassurance, but honestly compelled her to be cautious. We're learning more about the condition every hour. I've been in contact with specialists at CDC who are analyzing blood samples and working to develop treatment options. What Elena didn't mention was that her conversation with Dr. Chen had revealed the sophisticated nature of the biological agent, something designed to evade immune response and resist conventional treatment. The CDC was essentially starting from scratch in developing countermeasures. As Elena worked to stabilize Torres, Margaret approached with news that would complicate the situation further. Doctor, I reached storage unit 47, Margaret said quietly. You need to see what Paul brought back. Elena left Torres in Nurse Chen's capable hands and accompanied Margaret to the base storage facility. Unit 47 was small and cramped, filled mostly with Paul's military equipment and personal documents. But in the back corner, wrapped in plastic and hidden beneath spare uniforms, Margaret had found Paul's unauthorized collection. Elena opened the package carefully, revealing a worn leather journal and several small containers filled with dark, oily soil. The journal contained Paul's private observations about the mission, written in his careful handwriting and illustrated with detailed sketches of the facility and the specimens they had discovered. The entries painted a picture of growing horror as Paul realized what they had found. Day 3. The facility is definitely active. Found evidence of recent experimentation on large mammals. The specimen storage area contains cultures dating back to 1962, but the most recent samples are labeled with last month's date. Someone has been continuing the Soviet biological weapons program. Elena turned the page to find sketches of strange symbols carved into the facility walls, alongside Paul's notes about the research staff they had observed. Americans and Europeans working together. Dr. Petrov seemed to be in charge, but he was taking orders from someone via satellite phone. Heard him mention Project Midnight Sun multiple times. The final entries were increasingly desperate. Day 6. Torres and I both showing symptoms of exposure. Circular lesions on hands and arms. The infected tissue has an unusual odor and seems to glow faintly in darkness. We need to get this evidence back to command, but I'm worried about exposing our families. Margaret read over Elena's shoulder, her face pale with understanding. He knew he was infected, but came home anyway. He was trying to protect his country, even if it killed him. Elena felt the weight of Paul's sacrifice, but she also understood the terrible irony of his situation. The evidence he had risked his life to collect was proof of American involvement in biological weapons research that violated international treaties and endangered anyone who came into contact with it. Margaret, we need to get these containers to a secure laboratory immediately. The soil samples could be the key to developing treatment for Paul and Torres. As they prepared to leave the storage unit, Elena noticed the sound she had learned to recognize during her years of military service: helicopter rotors approaching the base. Through the small window of the storage facility, she could see military vehicles surrounding the hospital. "They're coming for Paul," Margaret said, her voice filled with fear and anger. "They're going to take him away, and we'll never see him again." Elena realized that her defiance of Colonel Harrison's transfer orders had forced the military to escalate their response. If they couldn't transfer Paul through normal medical channels, they would simply remove him by force. "Margaret, we need to get back to the hospital immediately, and we need to take Paul's evidence with us." As they drove back to the base hospital, Alana's phone rang. The caller ID showed Dr. Sarah Chun from the CDC. "Dr. Vasquez, we've completed our preliminary analysis of the blood samples. This biological agent is unlike anything we've encountered. It appears to be a hybrid of fungal and bacterial elements, genetically modified to target specific immune system responses. More importantly, we've identified markers that suggest it was designed to activate under specific condition: stress, fatigue, or exposure to certain environmental triggers." "Dr. Chun, are you telling me this was designed as a delayed action biological weapon?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you. Someone could be exposed to this agent and remain asymptomatic for weeks or months until the activation triggers are encountered. Dr. Vasquez, if this pathogen has been released into the general population, we could be looking at a biological catastrophe." Elena felt the true scope of the crisis becoming clear. Paul and Torres weren't just victims of an accidental exposure. They were early casualties in what could become a biological attack affecting thousands of people. "Dr. Chun, I have physical samples of the agent that were collected at the source. Can you arrange for secure transport to CDC for analysis?" "Absolutely. Dr. Vasquez, given the nature of this threat, CDC is prepared to invoke emergency protocols. We can provide federal protection for you and your patients if necessary." Elena realized that the military's attempts to suppress information about the biological agent could actually be interfering with efforts to develop countermeasures. By classifying Paul's case and attempting to transfer him away from competent medical care, they were potentially sacrificing not just individual soldiers, but public safety. As they arrived at the hospital, Elena could see military personnel establishing a perimeter around the building. Colonel Harrison was directing operations from a command vehicle, and Elena recognized the grim efficiency of a military unit preparing for a security operation. "Margaret, I want you to go directly to Paul's room and stay with him. Don't let anyone remove him without my authorization, regardless of what orders they claim to have." Elena entered the hospital through the emergency entrance, carrying Paul's journal and hoping to reach her patients before the military could implement whatever plan Harrison had developed. She realized that the next few hours would determine not just Paul's fate, but potentially the fate of countless others who might already be infected with a biological weapon designed to activate when they least expected it. The battle between medical ethics and military secrecy was about to reach its climax, with Elena caught in the middle of forces that were larger and more dangerous than anything she had faced in her long career. But looking at Paul's journal and thinking about his sacrifice to collect evidence of the biological weapons program, she knew she couldn't abandon him now, not when the truth he had risked his life to reveal might be the key to saving lives on a scale she was only beginning to understand. Elena reached Paul's room to find Margaret standing guard beside his bed, facing down two military police officers who were clearly uncomfortable with their orders to remove a dying man from medical care. Paul's condition had worsened dramatically. Black discoloration now covered most of his arms, and his breathing was so labored that Elena could hear it from the doorway. "Gentlemen," Elena said with calm authority, "you're interfering with critical medical care. I need you to step outside while I examine my patient." The senior MP, a sergeant with 20 years of service written in the lines around his eyes, looked genuinely conflicted. "Doctor, we have orders to secure this patient for transport." "Sergeant, look at him," Elena said, moving to Paul's bedside and checking his vital signs. "This man is dying. Moving him now would likely kill him within minutes." Elena's assessment wasn't an exaggeration. Paul's blood pressure was dangerously low, his heart rhythm irregular, and his oxygen saturation levels indicated that his respiratory system was failing. Whatever the biological agent was doing to his body, it was accelerating toward complete system shutdown. Margaret gripped Paul's hand tightly, tears streaming down her face. "Please," she whispered to the MPs, "he's my husband. He served his country for 30 years. Don't let them take him away to die alone." The sergeant's radio crackled with Colonel Harrison's voice demanding a status update. Elena could see the internal struggle playing out across the young soldier's face, loyalty to orders versus basic human decency. "Doctor," the sergeant said quietly, "I need you to understand that my orders come from very high up the chain of command. This isn't about military politics. This is about national security." Elena felt a flash of anger. "Sergeant, I've been serving this country's military for nearly 3 decades. Don't lecture me about national security while you're threatening to kill one of our own soldiers to protect someone's bureaucratic interests." Before the confrontation could escalate further, Nurse Chun appeared with urgent news. "Dr. Roberto, Torres is going into cardiac arrest." Elena rushed to Torres' room, leaving Margaret with the MPs and praying that their human decency would overcome their orders. Torres was indeed in critical condition, his heart struggling to pump blood through a system that was being systematically destroyed by the biological agent Dodd as Elena worked to stabilize Torres. She realized that both soldiers were following the same progression toward death. Whatever had been created in those Romanian laboratories was designed to kill slowly and agonizingly, allowing time for the victim to suffer while the pathogen spread through their system. Carmen Torres stood in the corner of the room, watching her husband fight for his life with the same helpless desperation that Margaret was experiencing. "Doctor, is there anything you can do? Anything at all?" Elena wished she could provide hope, but the conventional treatments weren't working. The antibiotics had no effect, the antifungal medications provided no relief, and the supportive care was only slowing the inevitable progression toward organ failure. "Carmen, I'm going to try something unconventional. There's a researcher who may understand this pathogen better than anyone else. I need you to trust me." Elena stepped outside the room and called the number she had found in Paul's journal for Dr. Dmitry Kozlov. The phone rang several times before a heavily accented voice answered. "Dr. Kozlov? This is Dr. Elena Vasquez, United States Army Medical Corps. I have soldiers who are dying from exposure to a biological agent that may be connected to your work in Romania during the Soviet era." There was a long pause before Kozlov responded. "Dr. Vasquez, you are speaking of things that should remain buried. Some knowledge is too dangerous to resurrect. Dr. Kozlov, these soldiers are dying. If you know anything about biological weapons research at Romanian facilities, I need your help." Another pause, longer this time. Elena could hear the weight of decades-old guilt and fear in Kozlov's breathing. "Doctor, what you are describing sounds like Project Midnight Sun. If I am correct, your soldiers have been exposed to a synthetic organism that we developed in the 1960s. It was designed to be the ultimate biological weapon, undetectable, untreatable, and delayed in its activation." Elena felt her heart sink. Undetectable and untreatable? At the time, yes. But doctor, I have spent the last 30 years of my life trying to develop countermeasures for the weapons I helped create. I may have something that could help your soldiers, but using it would be extremely dangerous. Dr. Kozlov, what kind of dangerous? The treatment is experimental, never tested on humans. It could save them, or it could accelerate their deaths. And doctor, if I help you, there are people who will want both of us dead. Project Midnight Sun was never officially terminated. It was transferred to joint international oversight. American and European scientists have been continuing our work. Elena realized that Dr. Kozlov was confirming Paul's worst fears. The biological weapons program hadn't ended with the Cold War. It had evolved into an international conspiracy involving multiple governments and potentially thousands of victims. Dr. Kozlov, where are you located? Can you come to our facility? Doctor, I am an old man living in exile. I have survived this long by staying hidden and avoiding attention. But if you can guarantee my safety and provide laboratory facilities, I will come. These soldiers should not die for the sins of their governments. Elena felt a mixture of hope and fear. Dr. Kozlov might represent the only chance of saving Paul and Torres, but involving him would mean openly defying not just military orders, but potentially international agreements about biological weapons research. As she returned to check on her patients, Elena found Colonel Harrison waiting for her with a document in his hand and an expression that suggested the military's patience with her defiance had reached its limit. Dr. Vasquez, this is a direct order from the Pentagon. You are to transfer both patients immediately, cease all independent research into their condition, and surrender any materials or information related to their exposure. Elena read the document quickly, noting the signatures of officials whose names she recognized from news reports about national security policy. Colonel, this order would constitute a death sentence for both soldiers. Doctor, you are exceeding your authority and interfering with matters of national security. If you continue to resist these orders, you will be placed under arrest for treason. Elena looked at the document again, realizing that the military was prepared to destroy her career and potentially her freedom to protect whatever secrets surrounded Project Midnight Sun. But thinking about Paul's sacrifice to collect evidence and Margaret's desperate vigil, she knew she couldn't abandon her patients now. Colonel, Elena said with quiet determination, I'm invoking my oath as a physician. These men are under my medical care, and I will not allow them to be moved until their condition stabilizes. If you want to arrest me for practicing medicine, then you'll have to do it in front of their families and the hospital staff. Elena realized she had just committed herself to a course of action that would likely end her military career and possibly result in criminal charges. But looking at Paul's deteriorating condition and Torres' struggle for life, she understood that some principles were worth sacrificing everything to defend. Dr. Dmitry Kozlov arrived at the base hospital under cover of darkness, escorted by CDC personnel who had arranged his transport under federal protection protocols. Elena met them at a side entrance, struck by the appearance of the man who might hold the key to saving Paul and Torres. Kozlov was in his 70s, with silver hair and intelligent eyes that carried the weight of terrible knowledge. His hands trembled slightly, whether from age or the gravity of the situation, Elena couldn't determine. He carried a small briefcase that he guarded carefully, and his expression suggested someone who had spent decades looking over his shoulder. Dr. Vasquez, Kozlov said in heavily accented English, I must see the patients immediately. If they are indeed infected with the Midnight Sun pathogen, time is critical. The organism follows a predictable progression, and once it reaches the final stage, nothing can save them. Elena led Kozlov to Paul's room, where Margaret maintained her vigil beside her husband's bed. Paul's condition had continued to deteriorate. The black discoloration now covered his chest and neck, and his breathing was so labored that each Breath seemed to require enormous effort. Kozlov examined Paul with the practiced efficiency of someone who had seen this pathogen's effects before. He studied the pattern of the infection, noted the phosphorescent quality of the infected tissue, and carefully documented the progression of symptoms. "Yes," Kozlov said grimly, "this is definitely midnight sun." The organism was designed to mimic multiple diseases while resisting all conventional treatments. It targets the immune system first, then begins consuming healthy tissue while producing toxins that cause organ failure. Margaret looked up from Paul's bedside with desperate hope. "Doctor, can you help him?" Kozlov opened his briefcase, revealing vials of clear liquid and detailed documentation written in multiple languages. "Mrs. Rains, I must be honest with you. What I have developed is experimental and extremely dangerous. The treatment involves introducing a synthetic virus that attacks the midnight sun organism, but it could also attack healthy cells. Your husband could die from the cure as easily as from the disease." Elena studied the documentation, noting the complexity of Kozlov's research. "Dr. Kozlov, have you tested this treatment on any living subjects?" "Only on laboratory animals, with mixed results. About 60% survived, but the treatment caused significant tissue damage in all cases. Dr. Vasquez, your soldiers are dying anyway. This may be their only chance." Elena felt the terrible weight of decision. As Paul's attending physician, the choice ultimately rested with her. But she also understood that Margaret, as his wife, deserved to have her voice heard in the decision. "Margaret," Elena said gently, "this is a choice only you and Paul can make. The treatment could save his life, but it could also cause additional suffering." Margaret looked at her husband's deteriorating condition, then at the experimental treatment that represented their only hope. "Dr. Kozlov, if Paul doesn't receive this treatment, will he die?" "Yes, Mrs. Rains. Based on the progression I'm observing, he has perhaps 24 hours before the infection causes complete organ failure." Margaret was quiet for several moments, clearly wrestling with an impossible decision. Finally, she spoke with the quiet strength that had sustained her through 30 years of military life. "Paul would want to fight. He's never given up on anything in his life, and I won't give up on him now. Dr. Kozlov, please try to save my husband." As Elena and Kozlov prepared to administer the experimental treatment, Colonel Harrison arrived with military police and a new set of orders. His expression was grim, and Elena could see that the situation had escalated beyond his ability to control. "Dr. Vasquez, you are under arrest for insubordination, interference with national security operations, and conspiracy to commit treason. Dr. Kozlov, you are also under arrest for unauthorized disclosure of classified information." Elena stepped between the MPs and her patient. "Colonel, you're interfering with critical medical treatment. This man will die if you interrupt the procedure." "Doctor, the decision has been made at levels far above my authority. Both patients are being transferred to a classified medical facility where they will receive appropriate care." Elena realized that the military's definition of appropriate care might not include actually trying to save Paul and Torres. If they were transferred to a classified facility, they would disappear into a system designed more to contain secrets than to preserve lives. "Colonel Harrison," Dr. Kozlov spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had worked on projects that transcended national boundaries. "You are making a terrible mistake. If these soldiers die without treatment, and if the midnight sun pathogen is released into the general population, you will be responsible for a biological catastrophe that could kill thousands of people." Harrison paused, clearly uncomfortable with the implications of Kozlov's warning. "Dr. Kozlov, you're speaking of classified matters that involve international agreements and national security protocols." "Colonel, I am speaking of genocide. Project Midnight Sun was designed to kill populations while leaving infrastructure intact. If someone has weaponized this pathogen and is testing it on American soldiers, your entire country could be at risk. Elena saw uncertainty flicker across Harrison's face. Despite his orders, the colonel was beginning to understand that the situation might be larger and more dangerous than his superiors had revealed. "Dr. Kozlov," Harrison said carefully, "what exactly are you proposing?" "Give me 2 hours to attempt treatment of these soldiers. If they die, you can arrest me and bury this entire incident in whatever classified files you choose. But if they survive, I will help you identify who is behind the weaponization of this pathogen and how to protect your military personnel from future exposure." Elena held her breath, recognizing that Kozlov was offering Harrison a way to justify allowing the treatment while still following orders. Harrison's radio crackled with demands for status updates, but Elena could see him weighing the potential consequences of different courses of action. Finally, Harrison made his decision. "Dr. Kozlov, you have 1 hour. If these soldiers don't show improvement within that time, all 3 of you will be transferred to federal custody." Elena felt a mixture of relief and terror. 1 hour wasn't much time to save 2 lives, but it was more than she had dared to hope for. As she and Kozlov prepared the experimental treatment, Margaret removed her wedding ring and placed it on Paul's infected hand, a calm gesture of faith and love that transcended the medical crisis surrounding them. "Paul," Margaret whispered, "you've always been stronger than anything that tried to defeat you. Fight this one more time. Come back to me." Elena realized that the next hour would determine not just the fate of Paul and Torres, but potentially the fate of countless others who might be infected with a biological weapon designed to kill slowly and invisibly. The battle between medical science and military secrecy was about to reach its climax, with 2 dying soldiers as the stakes in a game whose rules none of them fully understood. As Elena and Dr. Kozlov prepared to administer the experimental treatment, Elena's secure phone rang with a call that would change everything she thought she understood about the crisis. The caller identified himself as General Morrison, the commanding officer who had originally ordered Paul's mission to Romania. "Dr. Vasquez, I understand you've been treating soldiers who were exposed to biological agents during a classified operation. I need to speak with you immediately about the true nature of their mission." Elena felt a chill of apprehension. "General, I'm in the middle of critical medical treatment. Can this wait?" "Doctor, what you're about to do could compromise a decades-long operation that involves the security of our entire nation. I'm arriving at your facility within the hour, and I need you to postpone any experimental treatments until I can brief you on information that will change your understanding of this entire situation." Elena looked at Paul's deteriorating condition, then at Dr. Kozlov, who was preparing the synthetic virus treatment with the careful precision of someone who understood the deadly balance between cure and poison. "General, my patients may not survive another hour without treatment. Dr. Vasquez, your patients weren't accidentally exposed to a biological weapon. They were deliberately infected as part of a controlled study to test American military resistance to Soviet-era biological agents. What you're treating isn't an attack on our soldiers. It's the planned conclusion of an experiment that began 30 years ago." Elena felt the world shift beneath her feet. "General, are you telling me that our own military deliberately infected Paul and Torres?" "Doctor, I'm telling you that what you're seeing is the final phase of a carefully controlled study designed to protect our military personnel from biological weapons attacks. Both soldiers volunteered for this program, though they weren't told the specific nature of their exposure." Elena looked at Margaret, who was listening to the conversation with growing horror. The idea that Paul had been deliberately infected by his own government transformed his condition from a medical emergency into something far more sinister. "General Morrison, if this was a controlled study, where is the antidote? Where is the medical support that should have been provided too. Voluntary test subjects? There was a pause before Morrison answered, and Elena could hear the weight of institutional guilt in his silence. Dr. Vasquez, the study was designed to observe the natural progression of the pathogen. Providing treatment would have compromised the scientific validity of the research. Elena felt rage building in her chest. General, you're describing murder, disguised as medical research. You deliberately infected American soldiers and then withheld treatment to study how they died. Doctor, you don't understand the larger context. Project Midnight Sun represents one of the most serious biological threats our nation has ever faced. Understanding how this pathogen affects our military personnel is crucial to developing defensive strategies against enemy biological attacks. Dr. Kozlov, who had been listening to the conversation while continuing his preparations, spoke with quiet fury. General Morrison, I am the scientist who created the Midnight Sun pathogen. I know exactly what it does and how it kills. There is no scientific justification for allowing soldiers to die from an agent for which countermeasures exist. Elena realized that Morrison's admission had revealed the true scope of the conspiracy. Paul and Torres weren't victims of an accidental exposure. They were victims of their own government's willingness to sacrifice individual soldiers for institutional research goals. General, Elena said with cold determination, I'm going to treat these soldiers with Dr. Kozlov's experimental countermeasure. If you want to stop me, you'll have to do it by force in front of their families and my medical staff. Dr. Vasquez, you're interfering with a classified research program that has implications for national security. Both soldiers signed consent forms acknowledging their participation in experimental programs. Elena felt another piece of the puzzle fall into place. General, what consent forms? These soldiers were told they were going on a reconnaissance mission to Romania. Morrison's tone became defensive. The consent forms were signed during their initial military service agreements. All special operations personnel agreed to participate in classified training and research programs as part of their service obligations. Elena realized that the military was using deliberately vague language in service agreements to justify exposing soldiers to deadly biological agents without their specific knowledge or consent. Paul and Torres had believed they were serving their country, but they were actually serving as test subjects in an experiment designed to study their deaths. Dr. Kozlov, Elena said, how many other soldiers might be infected with this pathogen? Kozlov consulted his notes, his expression growing more troubled. If the Americans have been continuing the Midnight Sun program, there could be hundreds of test subjects. The pathogen can remain dormant for months or years before activation, depending on environmental triggers and individual immune response. Elena felt the true magnitude of the crisis becoming clear. The military hadn't just infected Paul and Torres. They had potentially infected hundreds of soldiers as part of an ongoing biological weapons research program that violated every principle of medical ethics and human rights. General Morrison, Elena said, I need a complete list of all personnel who have been exposed to this pathogen. If Dr. Kozlov's treatment is successful, we may be able to save lives beyond Paul and Torres. Doctor, that information is classified, above your clearance level. Your responsibility is to your immediate patients. Elena realized that Morrison was admitting to the existence of other victims while refusing to provide information that could save their lives. The military was willing to let soldiers die to protect the secrecy of their biological weapons research. As Elena and Kozlov began administering the experimental treatment to Paul, Margaret confronted Colonel Harrison with the fury of someone who had just learned that her husband's government had betrayed him. Colonel, you're telling me that Paul wasn't serving his country. He was being murdered by it. 30 years of faithful service, and this is how they repay him. Harrison looked genuinely disturbed by the revelations from General Morrison's call. Mrs. Raines, I wasn't aware of the classified aspects of your husband's mission. I was told this was a case of accidental exposure during routine operations. Elena realized that the conspiracy extended beyond the researchers and commanding officers to include a deliberate policy of compartmentalizing information so that even military personnel involved in patient care weren't told the truth about what they were dealing with. The experimental treatment was administered intravenously, with Dr. Kozlov monitoring Paul's vital signs for any indication of improvement or adverse reaction. Margaret held Paul's hand, whispering encouragement while watching for any sign that the synthetic virus was attacking the biological weapon that was killing her husband. Within minutes, Paul's condition began to change dramatically. His breathing became more labored initially, suggesting that Kozlov's synthetic virus was engaging the midnight sun pathogen in a biological battle that could either save Paul's life or accelerate his death. Elena watched the monitors carefully, noting fluctuations in heart rate and blood pressure that indicated Paul's body was responding to the treatment. Whether the response would be positive or negative remained to be seen, but for the first time since his hospitalization, something was actively fighting the biological weapon that had been slowly killing him. The revelation that Paul and Torres were victims of their own government's biological weapons research had transformed Elena's understanding of the crisis, but it had also strengthened her resolve to save them. If the military was willing to sacrifice soldiers for research purposes, then she would have to rely on her own medical judgment and Dr. Kozlov's expertise to provide the care that her patients deserved. The battle for Paul's life had become a battle against an institutional system that valued research data more than human lives. And Elena was prepared to fight that battle with everything she had learned in nearly 3 decades of military medicine. General Morrison arrived at the base hospital with a full security detail and an expression that suggested he was prepared to end Elena's defiance by whatever means necessary. Elena watched from Paul's room as military vehicles surrounded the building and armed personnel took positions at every entrance and exit. Dr. Vasquez, Morrison's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. You are hereby ordered to cease all unauthorized medical treatments and surrender custody of both patients to military medical personnel. Elena had prepared for this confrontation, but she hadn't prepared for the media attention that Margaret had orchestrated during the past hour. News vans were arriving at the base perimeter, and Elena could see reporters setting up outside the security cordon that the military had established around the hospital. General Morrison, Elena said with calm determination, I have a legal and ethical obligation to provide medical care to my patients. I will not surrender them to personnel who have admitted to using them as unwilling test subjects in biological weapons research. Morrison's expression hardened. Doctor, you are speaking of classified programs that involve national security. Your obligations to individual patients do not supersede your obligations to your country. Margaret stepped forward, holding a folder of documents that Elena recognized as Paul's complete military service record. General, my husband has served this country faithfully for 30 years. He's been wounded in combat. He's missed family milestones. He's risked his life in classified operations that he couldn't even tell his wife about. And this is how you repay that service, by using him as a laboratory rat? Morrison's security detail shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsettled by the emotional confrontation they were witnessing. Elena realized that not everyone involved in the operation understood the full context of what they were being asked to do. Mrs. Raines, your husband volunteered for special operations duty, which includes participation in classified research programs designed to protect American military personnel from enemy biological attacks. General Morrison, Dr. Kozlov interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of scientific authority. I created the midnight sun pathogen, and I can tell you definitively that there is no defensive value in allowing soldiers to die from it. The only purpose of this research is to study the weapon's effectiveness for potential offensive use. Morrison turned his attention to Kozlov with undisguised hostility. Dr. Kozlov, you are a foreign national who has violated multiple international agreements by developing biological weapons. Your presence here represents a security breach that will be dealt with accordingly. Elena felt the situation escalating toward a confrontation that could end in violence. Morrison's security detail was clearly prepared to use force to remove the patients, and Elena realized that her next words would determine whether the situation could be resolved peacefully. General Morrison, I'm invoking federal whistleblower protection protocols. As a military medical officer, I have a legal obligation to report violations of medical ethics and human rights. The deliberate infection of American soldiers with biological weapons constitutes both. Morrison's reaction was immediate and telling. Dr. Vasquez, whistleblower protections don't apply to classified military research programs. By discussing these matters with unauthorized personnel, you have committed treason. Elena realized that Morrison was essentially admitting that the biological weapons research was illegal, while arguing that the illegality itself made it classified and therefore protected from disclosure. The circular logic revealed the institutional corruption that allowed such programs to continue. Colonel Harrison, who had been listening to the confrontation with growing discomfort, finally spoke. General Morrison, I need to understand the legal authority for these actions. Dr. Vasquez has been following standard medical protocols for treating infected personnel. Morrison turned his attention to Harrison with obvious irritation. Colonel, you have been provided with the orders necessary to execute this operation. The legal justification is classified and not subject to discussion. Elena saw an opportunity in Harrison's apparent discomfort with the situation. Colonel, you took an oath to support and defend the Constitution. Does that oath include allowing American soldiers to be murdered for research purposes? Harrison looked genuinely conflicted, caught between loyalty to the chain of command and growing awareness that he was being asked to participate in something fundamentally wrong. Elena could see the internal struggle playing out across his face as he weighed his career against his conscience. At that moment, Paul's vital signs monitor began indicating significant changes. The experimental treatment was causing dramatic fluctuations in his heart rate and blood pressure, suggesting that Dr. Kozlov's synthetic virus was either saving Paul's life or killing him more quickly. Elena rushed to Paul's bedside, noting that the black discoloration on his arms was beginning to fade slightly around the edges. The phosphorescent quality of the infected tissue was becoming less pronounced, and his breathing seemed slightly less labored. Dr. Kozlov, Elena said urgently, are these signs of improvement or deterioration? Kozlov examined Paul carefully, checking his pulse and observing the changes in the infected tissue. The synthetic virus is attacking the midnight sun organism. These fluctuations indicate that the biological battle is reaching its climax. Within the next hour, we will know if the treatment has been successful. Margaret gripped Paul's hand tightly, watching for any sign of consciousness or awareness. Paul, if you can hear me, fight this. You've never given up on anything in your life. Don't give up now. Elena realized that Paul's response to the treatment could determine not just his survival, but the fate of potentially hundreds of other soldiers who might be infected with the same biological weapon. If Kozlov's countermeasure proved effective, it could save lives on a scale that justified the risks Elena had taken to obtain it. General Morrison observed the medical crisis with an expression that revealed his internal conflict. Elena could see that despite his orders to maintain secrecy about the biological weapons program, he was beginning to understand that Elena's defiance might be the only thing standing between Paul and a preventable death. Doctor, Morrison said, quietly, what are the chances that this experimental treatment will be successful? Elena looked at Paul's improving vital signs, then at Kozlov, who was monitoring the treatment with the intense focus of someone whose life's work was being tested under the most critical circumstances. General, Dr. Kozlov estimates a 60% chance of survival based on animal testing. But this is the first human application of the countermeasure. Morrison made a decision that surprised everyone present. Dr. Vasquez, you have one additional hour to demonstrate the effectiveness of this treatment. If Sergeant Rains shows continued improvement, I'm prepared to discuss expanding the treatment to other affected personnel. Elena felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Morrison's willingness to delay the forced transfer suggested that institutional self-interest might align with medical necessity if the treatment proved successful. But it also meant that Paul's life had become a test case for decisions that would affect countless other soldiers. As Elena continued monitoring Paul's response to the treatment, her secure phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Sarah Chun at the CDC. The message was brief, but urgent. Additional cases reported at 3 military bases. Activation pattern suggests coordinated exposure. Need immediate consultation. Elena realized that the crisis was expanding beyond Paul and Torres. If soldiers at multiple bases were showing symptoms of midnight sun infection, it meant that the biological weapons research program was more extensive than anyone had revealed. General Morrison, Elena said, showing him the CDC message. We're not dealing with an isolated incident. This appears to be a coordinated biological attack using American soldiers as test subjects. Morrison read the message with an expression that shifted from bureaucratic impatience to genuine alarm. Dr. Vasquez, what exactly is CDC reporting? Soldiers at 3 different bases showing symptoms consistent with midnight sun infection. The timing suggests they were all exposed during the same time frame as Paul and Torres. Elena watched Morrison process the implications. If multiple military installations were affected, the scope of the biological weapons program was larger than a single experimental study. It suggested a systematic effort to test the pathogen on American military personnel. Dr. Kozlov, who had been monitoring Paul's vital signs, looked up with urgent concern. General Morrison, if the midnight sun pathogen is being tested at multiple locations, you may be dealing with a rogue research program that has exceeded its original authorization. Morrison's radio crackled with urgent communications from his command post. Elena could hear fragments of reports about similar medical emergencies at other military facilities, confirming CDC's message about the expanding crisis. Dr. Kozlov, Morrison said, how many people could be affected if this pathogen has been released at multiple military installations? Kozlov consulted his research notes with the grim efficiency of someone who understood the weapon he had helped create. General, the midnight sun organism was designed for maximum transmission efficiency. If it has been weaponized and deployed at military bases, you could be looking at thousands of infected personnel. Elena felt the true magnitude of the crisis becoming clear. What had begun as an effort to save 2 soldiers had revealed a biological weapons program that threatened American military readiness on a massive scale. Margaret, who had been listening to the conversation while maintaining her vigil beside Paul's bed, spoke with quiet fury. General Morrison, you're telling us that Paul wasn't just infected as part of an experiment. He was infected as part of an attack on our own military? Morrison looked genuinely shaken as he processed the possibility that the biological weapons program had been compromised or exceeded its original parameters. Mrs. Rains, I need to make some urgent calls to determine the scope of what we're dealing with. As Morrison stepped away to coordinate with his superiors, Elena noticed that Paul's condition was continuing to improve. The black discoloration was receding more rapidly. His breathing was becoming more regular, and for the first time since his hospitalization, his vital signs suggested that his body was beginning to win the battle against a biological weapon. Dr. Kozlov, Elena said with cautious optimism, these changes suggest that your treatment is working. Kozlov examined Paul carefully, noting the improvement in his skin color and the reduction in the phosphorescent quality of the infected tissue. The synthetic virus appears to be successfully targeting the midnight sun organism. If this improvement continues, Sergeant Rains should make a full recovery. Margaret began crying with relief, squeezing Paul's hand and whispering words of encouragement. Elena felt a profound sense of professional satisfaction. After days of watching Paul deteriorate despite conventional treatment, they had finally found something that could save his life. But Elena also understood that Paul's recovery was just the beginning of a much larger challenge. If thousands of soldiers were infected with the same biological weapon, Elena and Dr. Kozlov would need to scale up production of the experimental treatment while navigating the political and security implications of a biological weapons program that had apparently spiraled out of control. Colonel Harrison returned with news that would complicate the situation further. Dr. Vasquez, I've been in contact with base commanders at the affected installations. They're reporting that infected personnel have been transferred to classified medical facilities, and their families are being told that the soldiers are participating in routine training exercises. Elena felt anger building in her chest. Colonel, the military is lying to families while their loved ones are dying from biological weapons exposure. Doctor, the classification level of this program requires that family members be provided with cover stories to protect operational security. Elena realized that the institutional response to the biological weapons crisis prioritized secrecy over human welfare, even when dealing with American military families who deserved to know that their spouses and children were fighting for their lives. Colonel Harrison, Elena said with quiet determination, I'm going to treat every infected soldier that you bring to this facility. I'm going to do it with full transparency to their families about their condition and prognosis. Harrison looked uncomfortable with Elena's declaration, clearly recognizing that it represented a direct challenge to military policy regarding classified medical programs. General Morrison returned from his urgent consultations with an expression that suggested the situation had escalated well beyond his ability to control. Dr. Vasquez, I've been authorized to offer you a choice. You can continue treating these soldiers under military oversight, with full security clearance and access to classified resources. Or you can be arrested for treason and interference with national security operations. Elena looked at Paul's improving condition, then at Margaret's hopeful face, then at Dr. Kozlov, who was preparing to treat Roberto Torres with the same experimental countermeasure that was saving Paul's life. General Morrison, Elena said, I choose to save soldiers' lives. Whatever classification level that requires, whatever security clearance that demands, whatever political consequences that involves, I choose to practice medicine according to my oath to do no harm. Elena realized that her decision would define not just her own future, but potentially the future of every soldier who had been infected with biological weapons in the name of national security research. The battle to save Paul and Torres had become a battle for the principle that American soldiers deserved medical care that prioritized their lives over institutional secrecy. The climax of the crisis was approaching, and Elena was prepared to risk everything she had built in her military career to ensure that no soldier died unnecessarily from a biological weapon that could be defeated with courage, scientific knowledge, and the willingness to put human lives before bureaucratic convenience. Elena administered Dr. Kozlov's experimental treatment to Roberto Torres while General Morrison coordinated the emergency response to what had become a multi-base biological crisis. Torres' condition was more advanced than Paul's had been, and Elena could see that the synthetic virus would need to work more aggressively to save his life. Dr. Kozlov, Elena said, as they monitored Torres' vital signs, his infection has progressed further than Paul's. Will the treatment still be effective? Kozlov studied Torres' chart with the grim expression of someone who understood the narrow, window for successful intervention. The synthetic virus can still attack the midnight sun organism, but Sergeant Torres' immune system has been more severely compromised. His chances of survival are perhaps 40%. Carmen Torres gripped her husband's hand, watching the monitors that tracked his heart rate and blood pressure. "Doctor, please tell me he's going to be okay." Elena wished she could provide reassurance, but Torres' condition was deteriorating even as the treatment was administered. His breathing was more labored than Paul's had been, and the black discoloration covered most of his upper body, suggesting that the biological weapon had spread throughout his system. "General," Morrison's radio crackled with urgent reports from other military installations. Elena could hear fragments of conversations about additional casualties, overwhelmed medical facilities, and families demanding answers about their missing soldiers. "Dr. Vasquez," Morrison said, his voice carrying the stress of someone managing a crisis that had exceeded all contingency plans. "CDC is reporting that we may have over 200 infected personnel across multiple installations. Can you scale up production of Dr. Kozlov's treatment?" Elena looked at the limited supplies that Kozlov had brought, realizing that they had enough experimental countermeasure for perhaps 20 patients. "General, Dr. Kozlov brought research quantities, not production quantities. We need industrial scale synthesis to treat hundreds of soldiers." Morrison's expression darkened as he processed the implications. "Doctor, how long would it take to produce sufficient quantities of the treatment?" Dr. Kozlov consulted his research notes, calculating the complex chemistry required to synthesize the synthetic virus in large quantities. "General, with proper laboratory facilities and experienced technical staff, perhaps 2 weeks for initial production. But we would need to test each batch to ensure effectiveness and safety." Elena felt the terrible mathematics of the crisis. If soldiers were dying at multiple installations and the treatment required weeks to mass produce, hundreds of American military personnel would die while waiting for medical care that could save their lives. At that moment, Torres' vital signs crashed. His heart rate spiked dramatically before dropping to dangerous levels, and his blood pressure fell so rapidly that Elena feared he was going into shock. "He's going into cardiac arrest," Elena announced, calling for emergency resuscitation equipment. "Carmen, please step outside while we work on Roberto." Elena and her medical team worked frantically to stabilize Torres, using every technique they had learned in years of trauma medicine. But Torres' condition continued to deteriorate, suggesting that the biological weapon had progressed beyond the point where even Dr. Kozlov's experimental treatment could save him. "Dr. Vasquez," Kozlov said quietly, "the synthetic virus may be causing an adverse reaction with his compromised immune system. We may need to discontinue the treatment." Elena faced a terrible choice that defined emergency medicine continuing, a treatment that might save a patient's life or kill him more quickly. Torres' body was failing, and Elena couldn't determine whether the failure was caused by the biological weapon or by their attempt to cure it. Margaret Rains appeared in the doorway, having left Paul's bedside to witness the emergency with Torres. "Doctor, how is Roberto?" Elena couldn't provide the hopeful answer that Margaret was seeking. "Margaret, Roberto's condition is very serious. The treatment may not be effective for patients whose infection has progressed as far as his." General Morrison watched the medical emergency with an expression that revealed his growing understanding of the human cost of the biological weapons program. Elena could see that despite his institutional loyalty, Morrison was beginning to recognize that American soldiers were dying from weapons created by their own government. "Dr. Vasquez," Morrison said quietly, "if we lose Sergeant Torres, what does that tell us about the effectiveness of the treatment for other infected personnel?" Elena continued working to stabilize Torres while considering Morrison's question. "General, it tells us that early intervention is critical. Soldiers who receive treatment within the first few days of symptom onset have a much better chance of survival." Morrison's radio reported more urgent updates from other military bases. Elena could hear that medical emergencies were escalating at multiple installations, with personnel collapsing during routine duties and being rushed to military hospitals that weren't equipped to handle biological weapons casualties. Elena realized that Torres' fight for life had become a test case for the treatment that might need to save hundreds of other soldiers. If he died despite their efforts, it would confirm the narrow window for successful intervention and emphasize the urgency of identifying and treating infected personnel before their conditions became terminal. The experimental treatment was either saving Torres' life or accelerating his death, and Elena would know within minutes which outcome would define the future of the response to the largest biological weapons crisis in American military history. Torres' vital signs stabilized suddenly, as if his body had reached a turning point in its battle against both the biological weapon and the experimental treatment. Elena watched the monitors with cautious hope as his heart rate returned to normal. Ranges in his blood pressure began climbing back toward acceptable levels. "Dr. Kozlov," Elena said, hardly daring to believe what she was seeing. "The treatment appears to be working." Kozlov examined Torres carefully, noting that the black discoloration was beginning to fade around the edges, just as it had with Paul. The synthetic virus has successfully engaged the midnight sun organism. Sergeant Torres should make a full recovery. Carmen Torres collapsed into a chair beside her husband's bed, overwhelmed with relief after watching him fight for his life. "Doctor, thank you. Thank all of you." Elena felt profound satisfaction at having saved Torres' life, but she also understood that his recovery confirmed the effectiveness of Dr. Kozlov's treatment and created urgent pressure to scale up production for the hundreds of other soldiers who might be infected. General Morrison received a call that would change the trajectory of the entire crisis. After a brief, tense conversation, he addressed Elena and Dr. Kozlov with an expression that suggested significant developments. "Dr. Vasquez, Dr. Kozlov, I've just been informed that the biological weapons program responsible for these infections has been operating without proper oversight or authorization. The soldiers were infected as part of research that violated federal law and international treaties." Elena felt vindication mixed with anger. "General, are you telling us that this entire crisis resulted from illegal biological weapons research?" "Doctor, I'm telling you that certain elements within the military-industrial complex have been conducting unauthorized experiments on American personnel. The program was supposed to be defensive research, but it appears to have become offensive weapons development." Dr. Kozlov spoke with the authority of someone who understood the institutional dynamics that enabled such programs to operate in secret. "General Morrison, biological weapons research always begins with defensive justifications. But the knowledge required to defend against biological weapons is identical to the knowledge required to create them." Elena realized that Paul and Torres had been victims of a program that had evolved from legitimate defensive research into illegal weapons development, using American soldiers as unwilling test subjects to perfect biological agents for potential offensive use. "General Morrison," Elena said, "what happens now? How do we treat the hundreds of other soldiers who may be infected?" Morrison's response revealed the scope of the institutional response that was being organized. "Dr. Vasquez, you and Dr. Kozlov are being transferred to a secure CDC facility where you'll oversee the mass production of the treatment. Every infected soldier will receive the experimental countermeasure, regardless of classification level or security concerns." Elena felt both relief and apprehension. Relief that the military was finally prioritizing soldier welfare over institutional secrecy. Apprehension about the challenges of scaling up an experimental treatment for mass distribution. Colonel Harrison appeared with news about the ongoing investigation into the biological weapons program. "Dr. Vasquez, federal agents have arrested Dr. Petrov and several other researchers involved in the unauthorized experiments. The Romanian facility has been secured, and all biological materials have been contained. Elena thought about Paul's journal entries describing the active research facility they had discovered. Colonel, what about the American personnel who were working at the Romanian site? Under federal investigation for violations of biological weapons treaties and crimes against military personnel. Dr. Vasquez, your documentation of this crisis and your refusal to allow the cover-up may have saved hundreds of lives. Elena looked at Paul, who was now conscious and alert for the first time since his hospitalization. Margaret was beside him, tears of joy streaming down her face as she held his hand. "Paul," Elena said, approaching his bedside, "how are you feeling?" Paul's voice was hoarse but clear. "Doctor, thank you for fighting for us when no one else would. Margaret told me what you risked to save our lives." Elena felt the profound satisfaction that came from practicing medicine according to her highest principles, even when those principles conflicted with institutional pressure. "Paul, you and Roberto are heroes. You risked your lives to expose illegal biological weapons research, and your courage may have prevented a much larger biological catastrophe." Margaret squeezed Elena's hand with gratitude that transcended words. "Doctor, I don't know how to thank you for bringing my husband back to me." Elena realized that her decision to defy military orders and treat Paul with an experimental countermeasure had not only saved individual lives, but it exposed a biological weapons program that threatened American military personnel on a massive scale. Dr. Kozlov, who had been preparing for transport to the CDC facility, approached Elena with the respect of one scientist for another. "Dr. Vasquez, you have shown that medical ethics must sometimes override institutional loyalty. Together, we will ensure that no soldier dies unnecessarily from biological weapons created by their own government." Elena understood that the battle to save Paul and Torres had become a victory for the principle that individual human lives must be valued above institutional convenience, even in matters of national security. The crisis was ending, but the work of healing and accountability was just beginning. 6 months later, Elena sat in a congressional hearing room, raising her right hand to take an oath that would define the final chapter of her military career. The hearing room was packed with families of affected soldiers, members of Congress, and media representatives who had followed the biological weapons scandal from its initial exposure to its legislative resolution. "Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" the committee chairman asked. "I do," Elena replied, looking out at the audience and recognizing Margaret Raines in the front row, accompanied by Paul, who appeared healthy and strong after his complete recovery from the midnight sun infection. Elena's testimony would provide the definitive medical account of the biological weapons crisis that had infected over 300 American military personnel across 12 installations. Dr. Kozlov's experimental treatment had been successfully mass-produced and administered to all affected soldiers, with a survival rate of 87% among those who received early intervention. "Dr. Vasquez," the committee chairman began, "please tell us in your own words how you discovered that American soldiers were being used as test subjects in illegal biological weapons research." Elena spoke clearly and directly, describing the progression from Paul's mysterious symptoms to the revelation that he and hundreds of other soldiers had been deliberately infected with a Soviet-era biological weapon as part of unauthorized research conducted by American scientists. The soldiers affected by this program believed they were serving their country through legitimate military operations, Elena testified. Instead, they were being used as laboratory subjects to test the effectiveness of biological weapons that violate international treaties and basic human rights. Elena's testimony detailed the institutional obstacles she had faced in treating Paul and Torres, including direct orders to stop providing medical care and threats of arrest for treason. She described the courage of Dr. Kozlov in providing the experimental treatment that had saved hundreds of lives. Dr. Vasquez, a committee member, asked, "What reforms would you recommend to prevent similar incidents in the future?" Elena had prepared carefully for this question, understanding that her recommendations could shape military medical policy for decades to come. First, all military medical personnel must have absolute authority to provide care to soldiers without interference from command structure or security classifications. Second, any research involving human subjects must have full informed consent and independent medical oversight. Third, soldiers must have legal protection to report medical ethics violations without fear of retaliation. The hearing continued for 3 days with testimony from recovered soldiers, family members, and other medical personnel who had been involved in treating infected personnel. Paul Raines testified about his mission to Romania and his decision to collect evidence of the biological weapons program despite the personal risk. "I took an oath to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic," Paul said. "When I discovered that American citizens were conducting biological weapons research that threatened our own military personnel, I knew I had to gather evidence, regardless of the personal consequences." Margaret Raines testified about the impact on military families, describing the weeks of uncertainty when she didn't know whether her husband would survive and couldn't understand why he was being denied potentially life-saving medical care. "Military families accept that our loved ones may die in service to their country," Margaret said. "We don't accept that they should die from weapons created by their own government and then be denied medical care to protect institutional secrecy." The congressional investigation resulted in comprehensive reforms to military medical policy, criminal charges against researchers involved in the unauthorized biological weapons program, and compensation for affected soldiers and their families. Elena had chosen to retire from military service rather than continue working within an institution that had been willing to sacrifice individual soldiers for research purposes. She established a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting the rights of military personnel in medical research and providing advocacy for soldiers facing ethical violations by their own command structure. Dr. Kozlov became a senior consultant to the CDC, working to develop countermeasures for biological weapons while ensuring that defensive research never again evolved into offensive weapons development. His collaboration with Elena had saved hundreds of lives and exposed institutional corruption that threatened American military readiness. Elena often visited Paul and Margaret Raines at their home, where Paul had returned to simple pleasures that his brush with death had made infinitely precious. He tended a garden behind their house, spending hours among tomatoes and roses that represented life and growth after his encounter with biological destruction. "Doctor," Paul said during one of Elena's visits, "I've been thinking about something you said during my treatment. You said that some principles are worth sacrificing everything to defend." Elena nodded, remembering the moment when she had decided to defy military orders to provide medical care to her patients. "I've realized that serving your country sometimes means challenging it when it loses its way," Paul continued. "What you did for Roberto and me, that was real patriotism. You risked your career to save soldiers when the institution was willing to sacrifice us for research purposes." Elena felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing she had practiced medicine according to her highest principles, even when those principles conflicted with institutional pressure. Her decision to treat Paul and Torres with experimental countermeasures had not only saved their lives, but had exposed a biological weapons program that threatened American military personnel on a massive scale. As she watched Paul work in his garden, Alana reflected on the lesson that the crisis had taught her about the relationship between individual conscience and institutional loyalty. Sometimes, she understood, serving the highest ideals of your country required challenging the institutions that claimed to represent those ideals. Elena's retirement from military service had begun a new chapter in her life, one dedicated to ensuring that no soldier would ever again be sacrificed for research purposes without full knowledge and consent. The battle she had fought to save Paul and Torres had become a victory for the principle that individual human dignity must be protected, even in matters of national security. The healing would continue for years, but the truth had finally been told, and justice had finally been served.